Hello.
Hi.
I'm Alex.
I'm Val.
We're here to talk about more Sopranos.
Yep. We just watched Full Leather Jacket.
Mm-hmm.
Season 2, episode 8.
Yep.
And
We're ready to talk about it.
We're kind of ready to talk about it. I remembered a lot of scenes from this episode, in the context of the show, but again, I don't remember them all happening in the Leather Jacket episode. That story kind of stands out on its own. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how you want to approach it. It's a kind of a funnier episode to try to do this for.
It is. I mean, it definitely becomes an episode where it really kind of propels the plot of season 2 forward. The events at the very end are pretty pivotal.
I think also kind of some of the philosophical stuff in the show, though, too, is
totally.
At least I don't know. There's a lot of these monologues or bits of dialogue that seem to hold more significance than just in that moment of the story, but kind of for the show on a whole. But
definitely.
Some of them are hard to figure out. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, as always, I feel like there's kind of an angle, and they're examining morality and principles and kind of the values of the Sopranos and Soprano world kind of within this episode, like they do in a lot of episodes, and they kind of come at it from a certain angle. And I think that that's definitely happening in this episode. There's kind of a theme and a focus to the way that they examine these characters and go a little bit deeper.
It's just amazing how they can do both of those things. They can not only propel the action forward, but they can also do these kind of in-depth character sketches, of Jeannie and Joan Cusimano in this episode, or to be able to...
Joan, who's actually a new character.
Well, exactly, right? And do we even see her again afterwards? I think she's just confined to that episode, but you have this understanding of these sisters, these twin sisters,
even
played
Jeannie's
by the same...
essentially a new character.
Well,
I mean,
totally,
we haven't really examined her as a character yet. We wouldn't have been able to
say anything
give her
about
personality characteristics where you could now.
But yeah, and this is the shortest episode.
The shortest episode, I think, in the entire series.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really shocking. I mean, they really use that to strong effect. I mean, when Christopher's shot at the end and it's just over.
Yeah.
I mean, it really hammers home the significance of that event.
Yeah. How do we want to go through this?
So going to what I was saying, I feel like all of the episodes of Sopranos kind of take a certain angle and a kind of approach to examining these characters and the issues at play. So I feel like that's happening. And what you were saying, I think, is really interesting, is it's amazing how they can do multiple things at once. So I feel like that's even kind of happening. There's multiple different angles kind of happening within one episode. So I thought with Carmela, and her story with Jeannie and Joan Cusimano, there's kind of an examination of principles and selfishness and kind of protecting your family and caring about yourself and by extension your family without really thinking of the implications of how that would affect other people or the fairness or the justice of that.
Yeah.
So I feel like that actually kind of got deeper into who some of the characters are, in particular Carmela. I also thought with Matt and Sean and their interactions with Christopher and Furio and Richie, there's a lot of kind of focus on masculinity and asserting themselves and kind of proving themselves. And I thought that was kind of something that was kind of established during this episode. And then I think there was also separately, those are kind of the two things that I was thinking of kind of jumping into.
Yeah.
But then that last scene with Melfi I thought was a little bit interesting and
that's
rather
the one
profound,
I'm thinking
even though it was so short. But this kind of
it goes
duality
back to
of
last episode.
It does. It's kind of they're kind of expanding on that. But it's interesting to have this. It's kind of unresolved, but it's unresolved with this kind of duality of these two completely contradicting interpretations of the information. So you have Tony, who thinks that he was having Meadow
shielded, or...
Well, he thinks that he was rubbing her face in his business by giving the car, whereas Melfi thinks that he was giving the car in order to confront moral ambiguities.
And encourage her to confront moral ambiguities.
Yeah, and as she leaves, to kind of encourage her development.
Yeah.
And so, that was really interesting, because that is left kind of unresolved, and it's complicated, and I think that is kind of an example of ambiguity, because I'm not sure how to take that. I'm not sure if Melfi is correct Tony is
No,
correct.
I know.
Or if they both are, if there's kind
Yeah.
of like a more nuanced kind of combination of those two things that's actually the truth.
Yeah. No, for sure. I thought that was a really interesting scene.
Yeah, and Tony kind of references, when he brings it up, to rub her nose in it. So it's actually like a kind of like punitive action. Mm-hmm. Or spiteful or something.
Yeah.
That he could have known. And then he says, well, why didn't I? I don't know. And then Melfi actually thinks that they're coming to a breakthrough on this. And that's interesting because Melfi thinks that they're coming to a breakthrough with an interpretation that actually gives Tony a lot of credit.
Yeah.
And Tony's upset by that.
And he doesn't like that. He's like, you're telling me I like rubbed her face in this shit, and you're telling me I did something noble.
And that's something that he's talked about in the past, saying that he doesn't like that being made to feel like he's a victim. In fact, he just said that in the, in a very recent session.
The other thing that's interesting there, it kind of, again, it goes back to last episode with the happy wanderer thing. I forget exactly the words that he uses to describe it, but basically he's talking about Dave Scavino from last episode, and talks about how he's a degenerate gambler, but he's also respected in the community.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what he's jealous of. Like, that kind of also, like, defines that happy wanderer thing for him, right? That this is someone who can, like, be a degenerate, but, like, still has the respect of their community. And I think it links in... I think it links into, like, what Carmela's going through, too, because Carmela can't just be a mom who's asking for a letter of recommendation from a lawyer, right? It's that, like, that scene that she plays so beautifully in Joan Cusimano's office, where she's like, what, me threatening? And she's coming across as very threatening. Like, she could never be seen as anything but a mob wife. Yeah. Right? And so in terms of kind of accessing, like, being respected in the community, so whether that's, like, your neighborhood or, like, the Georgetown community, for example, there's always kind of this, shade over the Soprano family because of who they are, right? Yeah. So I thought that was interesting for, like, both Tony, like, defining what it is about the happy wanderer that bothers him so much, but also, like, in light of Carmela's situation. Right. Too.
And also that duality there, like that contradiction of somebody who's a respected member of the community, but also has, like, this crippling kind of darker side. Yeah. Yeah. Jeannie Cusimano, I never knew she was such, like, I don't know, like, she just, like, repeats back things people have told her to say. Right. Like, I didn't see her as kind of so And she's anxious. Yeah.
She's so anxious. I mean, to good, like, for good reason. Yeah. It's kind of the first time we see, like, how would you feel living beside someone like that, right? Yeah. Like, you actually would be really anxious and scared, right? We kind of are, based on the way this show makes you feel, we're inclined to kind of like the Soprano family, or at least empathize with them, but then we can actually see how they're perceived by the outside world. Yeah. In this episode, maybe is some of the first time we kind of see the different worlds that they're not part of. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, in terms of that whole kind of arc, so that was one of the kind of the two main angles that I was kind of seeing in terms of, like, complexity and kind of delving more into who the characters are, and also examining, like, the themes and principles that this show is always talking about. For me, Carmela engaging with Joan Cusimano, there's this aspect of selfishness, and it's indicative of her principles, I think, that really stood out to me. So it's like kind of like the non-morality of her back channeling, and that she's not willing to let things take her course, and she's not willing to kind of, like, let the system work things out. She needs to be kind of involved in kind of a unfair, stacked kind of way, because that's kind of the only way that family is made a living. And then also, like, when she brings the reegot pie with pineapples to her, again, it's like this way of using food as a control mechanism. Yeah. But, she says, the sad fact is that that's just not enough these days. When she says, well, Georgetown will see that. Yeah. And it's this idea that, like, they kind of, or she in particular, although all of them kind of see the world as this kind of zero-sum game. And that if they don't get involved, that
it's going to go and benefit somebody else. So they need to kind of like cast their lot. But the reality is that their actions are so toxic that it's always taking away from somebody else.
Yeah.
So, you know, I thought that was really relevant when Joan was talking about the person who she already wrote the letter for.
Nice Dominican boy.
You know, the nice Dominican boy with a 5.2 GPA from the project.
Yeah.
Right. And so thinking about, and then Carmela saying, you know, I was thinking that you could go to Georgetown and say that Georgetown wasn't his first choice. And it's like, well, that's insanely fucked up.
Yeah, that part was really fucked up.
That's really crazy to think about. Now you're taking something away from him who, when you think about it, clearly has earned this so much more. And also comes from a place where he doesn't benefit from the privilege that Meadow has.
Yeah, exactly.
And nonetheless, she wants to have her way. And even though there's something that, like, she kind of comes across in a way that's like, I don't want to say non-threatening because it is threatening to the outside world, but there's something kind of like tame about her actions.
It's a little bit like Livia. It's kind of like who, me?
Yeah.
Like, I wasn't being threatening.
And also it's like, that's something that exists in the world, which is a really kind of like frustrating thing.
Totally.
But that's something that can kind of be seen as, oh, she's just looking out for her family in some circles, and you could kind of see it as almost a positive thing or an endearing characteristic of hers. But the reality is that she's actually like taking something away from somebody who's actually had a lot less opportunity and has actually earned their position through actual relationships.
I guess like it's hard for me to judge the Sopranos too harshly on that. Like they're also at a disadvantage in the way that private schools in the United States work. Like, they don't have the privilege that, like, someone who, you know, had a closer relative, like Hunter Scangarella, whose aunt went to read or whatever.
Well, her dad is David Chase.
Well, we know that in real life. But, like, that's how the system fucking works here, it is about who you know and other rich people writing letters for you because they went to that college. It's this, like, nepotism kind of system. So, like... that's already happening. Yeah. The Soprano family is just trying to like get into that. Like they're trying to access this world that they don't really have an into.
Which is interesting too.
Meadow would be the first person to go to university, I think, right? Like,
well, Tony went
for a day or whatever. You know, like they don't have that same level of access into the system. Yeah. And so for me, there's just like these multi-level. It's almost like The Wire in some ways. Like this episode had a few of those elements where I think it was like examining some like larger societal issues and showing, I don't know, like the multiple layers of access, like with the Dominican boy, then the Soprano family, then like, you know, Georgetown alumnus or whatever. Well, and how in each of those circles there's going to be like different ways of dealing with these same concepts, right? Or different like levels of privilege within those systems.
Yeah, absolutely.
So like I wasn't like, I mean, it was threatening what Carmela did and like really over the top, but at the same time, like there's worse shit going on within that system already. Like they were just trying to get in.
Right.
To
and there's
a
an
system
aspect
that is broken. It is a broken system.
Yeah. And there's an aspect of relativism too. Like I think that all characters in Soprano world are always kind of like comparing themselves to others and feeling like they're left out and that they want to get something. Yeah. And the Sopranos are no exception. So they see these things, especially in the context of like maneuvering relationships and kind of like maneuvering those to benefit oneself, very much kind of in the same way that like the mafia ties kind of work. So that's kind of a world that at least Tony in particular is very familiar with and kind of makes his living from by kind of like owning and manipulating and working with this kind of series of relationships and this network that he's cultivated in order to benefit himself. So they're kind of looking out and see the way that this kind of nepotism and relationship kind of,
like,
that it can work in the real world, and they're just kind of trying to be a part of that. Yeah. And I feel like everybody is kind of constantly feeling like they're missing something that other people around them have.
Well, the other interesting part about that whole element is when Carmela first got the letter from saw the letter from Berkeley. Yes. Right? She opened it, first of all, which you shouldn't do that to your teenagers. Don't open their mail. Yeah. It's bad. But then she takes the letter and she throws it away.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's her first instinct, is to, like, well, I guess kind of like what Tony was talking about with Melfi at the end in some ways. Like, she was trying to shield their family in some way from having Meadow go so far away. Right? So she was like, but then she realized that there's, like, a better way to do it. And it's kind of like through this then, like, manipulation. Like, she didn't have to let Meadow think that, you know, like, she didn't have to let Meadow know that why she got into Georgetown, right? Like, she could still let her send her transcripts to Berkeley.
Yeah.
And she felt like her manipulation of the system, like, so, you know, if she gets this letter from Joan Cusimano, that's going to work in her favor, right? Like, so instead of, like, taking something away, she's, like, adding in her manipulation.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting too. And actually I think that's a great read on it. Like, I thought that the fact that she threw it out and then went and took it out and actually did give it to Meadow also kind of differentiated Carmela as a character from some of the mob people, because she does kind of have a certain level of morality that maybe some other people don't. Like, her instinct is to throw it out, make it invisible, make it go away. And I think some other characters, when they want something, they would just do that.
Yeah.
But she is kind of like losing sleep over it and goes back and has to take it back.
Yeah. But there is that then added part of, like, taking a different tack. Like,
yeah,
which
no,
is
absolutely.
like, you know, still, like, as immoral, kind of. I mean, it seems more positive on an outward level, right? Like, she could feel good, like, oh, I helped my daughter to get this letter of recommendation, right?
Yeah.
Like, she can still kind of feel like she's coming out on top, but it's still the same level of manipulation, right? Whether she throws out the Berkeley letter or whether she, you know, gets this extra piece of evidence from Georgetown, it's the same result in a lot of ways.
Right.
Except that maybe
not
she
completely.
could see herself as the better person. I don't know.
She could have completely kiboshed Berkeley.
Yeah.
So it's still in play.
Yeah, I know, you're right.
You know, so it is like a toned down action from that.
I did like how Joan Cusimano called Meadow Fielder. Thought that was a good
Fielder
one.
Soprano.
Yeah. Fielder's a pretty cool name.
It's a good name. Yeah. Okay, how about Matt and Sean?
Okay. Why was he always taking a shit when they were opening these safes?
That's a pretty good question.
I didn't like that.
Well, I guess they talked about how Pussy did that when he was a cat burglar. Maybe that's like a rite of passage or like a thing that you do.
Like, one person's job is to shit and the other two are supposed to open the safe.
It's a pretty important thing to do. I mean, how else are they going to, you know, be so upset when they come to the office the next day?
I guess.
I thought that there was... Yeah, I mean, obviously this episode has kind of the culmination of their identity crisis and them trying to assert themselves. There was an interesting exchange during that scene when they're cracking the safe where there's just so much talk of who's the man and what men are that it really stood out for me as, like, they're obsessed with this idea of asserting their masculinity.
Oh, yeah.
And they're obsessed with being respected and being respected as men. So the exchange was like, he the man, talking about Tony Soprano. And then Christopher says, I thought you said I was the man. He the man, I the man, who's the man? And then the response is, are we not men? And it's just like incessant. Like, it's just, it's so much. It's so much there. And I feel like that's really at the center of kind of like who they are as characters. It's just this kind of like chase of being respected. And then throughout the episode, there's so many things that are happening where that's kind of thrown for a loop. Like, so that scene later on when Furio comes, that's really like, I think, like a very key scene. So they introduce it. The music is like this almost kind of like soft, like it's almost like porn music.
Yeah, and you see a lot of like
well, he has like his
like
bong
outlines of dicks.
Yeah, and it's like his bong is like gonna buy his dick.
Yeah.
It's like very phallic. They're in their underwear just kind of sitting around like smoking on this. Like it's a lot.
It's a lot.
They're really
I don't know why
suggesting homosexuality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
even though I don't
really
think they
good
are
friends. No.
at all. Like
No.
but I think that it's just like their interpretation of what it means to be homosexual. And that's not something that they want.
Yeah.
And that's seen as emasculating.
Yeah.
That that's how they come across. And then Furio comes, and this will be my only color thing, but like with his associate, all black. They're in like not even fully clothed, and what they're wearing is like white underwear.
Or gray.
There's just like this contrast between them as characters, and then also them as this kind of like these imposing, kind of like strong muscle members of the mob against them who aren't even clothed, and then just like pushed around to give them another $1,000. That really stood out to me as like, well, that probably is like kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back for them.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, I don't know, like, I found that part like a little bit heavy-handed for me. Like, maybe those two aren't like the strongest actors. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it was just the, you know, like the message they were trying to convey really clearly. But I don't really, the other thing I guess with that is like, I just don't really buy them shooting Christopher. Like, it just seemed like maybe I was missing a
because they have a relationship
something.
with him too.
That's the thing, and they know how close he is to Tony. Like, I just like I think they were smarter than that. But I don't know.
They do come across as pretty stupid.
They totally do. Yeah. But and I love how they're like, I went to Pace College. Like, they're like really mad about that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But I it seemed like a little too quick or something like that. Like, there was something like Richie didn't even really seem to give, like, for me, like, Richie wasn't even heavy-handed in saying anything bad about Christopher.
No, he was kind of just like shooting
he was just kind of like talking shit like he usually does, right? So, yeah. Maybe that's the point. I mean. Yeah.
Well,
and it's all the seasons
of all the seasons of Soprano, this is probably the one that gets some of the most flack.
I'm not even going there at all, because I love this show and like I think it's an amazing episode. But
that's fair, I think. I mean, I'm actually impressed by, in this season, for the most part, how efficient they are with a lot of things. Like, even to this point, Richie has had so little screen time, but he dominates the season so strongly.
Well, and this episode in particular is so good for Richie, like with this jacket thing. The jacket thing is so funny.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I always like I always like got it. I always like how do I say it? Like, I always appreciated like Richie's quirkiness with the jacket, but I didn't really appreciate like the other surrounding characters with the jacket too, like how like Polly and Silvio are like rolling their eyes at the jacket also. Like everyone's just kind of like, okay.
Nobody's interested. But for me, so that actually plays into what we're talking about masculinity, because for me, that jacket establishes Richie's masculinity, because he's obsessed with the story of how he took it off Rocky DeMeo, who was the toughest guy.
Yeah.
And then, you know, he showed him and then he got his jacket, and that's really meaningful to him, but nobody cares.
Yeah.
Like, that's meaningless. And I think what Richie has, as almost all the other characters have as well, is this like complete lack of empathy, complete lack of awareness of what other people value, and this obsession with themselves.
Yeah.
And this obsession with their values. And yet they don't hold any value for the other characters.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why it's so meaningful for Richie, because for him it's a really big deal. And the fact that he gives it to Tony, I think, is very meaningful for him.
Yeah.
Like, he truly is trying, and in his own way, that's about as much as he can try to make a peace offering.
Yeah.
And yet nobody cares. And then when Tony ends up giving it to Sasha.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting, too, because, you know, there's even that comment about how he was a mechanical engineer, and now he drives a cab. And Richie, you know, again, it's like, like, what about the justice of that? Like, Tony didn't want it. Like, who cares? Like, this guy can use the jacket.
Yeah.
But, like, that's not on anybody's radar at all. Like, Richie's just like completely furious and goes completely off the rails.
Yeah.
And we know that that's probably going to be like the instigating event that makes him come to like a head with Tony.
Yeah.
And that's where the climax and the main conflict of the season is going to come from. No, I'm just saying, you can tell that from watching this episode. You know that it's not going to end well.
Right.
You know that he's not just like taking it well.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's not going to like go to the spa and then be fine.
Right. That would be a good story. Well, you like, yeah, it's really interesting, and yeah, you could see how this based on what we know about Richie, right? And we see it kind of through the other part of his storyline in this episode with the Beansy and the ramp thing, right? These things are kind of intertwined. And I think it reflects exactly what you were saying, like his lack of empathy and his lack of being able to see how he has power over other people, right? Even though in like some interactions he's lower down on the food chain, he's like enacting this power wherever he can possibly do that.
Yeah.
The stuff with Beansy is interesting too, that like he's like under Richie's control.
Yeah.
I feel bad for Beansy.
Beansy has a really rough go of it.
I didn't really pick up on that in my previous viewings, I don't think. It
just really sucks to be Beansy.
It really sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like the interpretation that these characters, I talked about it being a zero-sum world.
Yeah.
It's because it is a zero-sum world.
Yeah.
For everybody involved with The Sopranos, at the end of the day, if somebody gets something, it comes from somewhere.
Yeah.
And so the reason why they interpret the world that way is because that's the way the world works for them. But it's sad to see, like, the lower you go down on the totem pole, the more people get screwed over. Mm-hmm. So even like Matt and Sean, that's part of the reason for their resentment, because they're just constantly getting passed over, screwed with.
Right. Like,
and because
Tony's cut comes out of their half, not out of Christopher's. Yeah. That's how it goes in the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let alone somebody like Beansy, who's like, life is taken away from him. Even he has zero agency. Even his wife doesn't even have the ability to tell Vito. Yeah, Vito. Vito, to not.
And his brother.
Yeah, to not install the ramp. She tries, but they're still gonna do it. So even that, which is like a, in quotation marks, like a positive, generous, action. She can't even reject that.
No, I know. It's really crazy.
Yeah.
The other scene that really stood out to me this episode was Christopher's very romantic proposal scene.
Very romantic.
That scene was crazy. I mean, you have him arriving at this, this home. You can tell it's kind of like not in the same suburbs where, Tony exists.
Yeah.
And you see Adriana's mom, and he kind of like pushes by her to get.
Actually, like pushes her.
Well, there's like he gets even more violent afterwards. Like like when they're already upstairs, he really pushes her out of the way. And then you have this shift, right, from like Adriana and her mother, like kind of being on this unified front. Yeah. And then when Christopher says that he wants to marry her, this like whole thing shifts, and the mom is still like speaking reason. Yeah. And Adriana's kind of pushing her away, and Christopher pushes her away as well. Yeah. And seeing that made me just feel so sad because. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, like it's you see these characters who like you love them, but again, kind of like you were saying with Beansy and the jacket, like, well, I don't think you can see that this is going anywhere good.
Doesn't seem it.
And Chris gives this kind of hopeful speech. He's like, what Tony said to me last week. He didn't say that, but at the party, like that really clarified things for me. And he's like, no drugs, like no messing around, eye on the prize. And she like wiggles her ring finger at him. Yeah. So he, maybe he'll do it.
Which
maybe
is interesting
this time
too.
He'll do it.
Well, it's interesting too, like as a prize, like she was essentially like kind of bought off by this like prospect of marriage and this ring, which is so material. Mm-hmm. Like in light of the facts of what was happening, like she should not be getting involved with this guy again. He's been such an asshole. And
that's what her mom is saying. And that was, that was harsh. She was like, and she was like, next time he breaks your heart or whatever it was, this door's closed. Yeah. It's pretty, that was a pretty heavy scene. Yeah. Yeah. And then we, then we see like the episode ends, of course, with Christopher in the hospital and Tony saying, how could this happen? How could this happen? Yeah. And I think that's kind of an important question. Like, how do you get here, right? Like, what are the factors that lead up to this, right? Yeah. And you can kind of trace it back in this episode even. Like, you can kind of trace back how this could have happened, right? Like,
even in that scene.
With the way he treats, these up-and-coming Matt Bevilacqua and Sean.
Yeah. Sean.
Giamonti, something like that.
I think so.
But you know.
We finally got it, though. We've had a few episodes where it was just Matt and
Sean.
friends. Yeah.
Well, now we don't really have to worry about Sean either.
Yeah,
Sean's,
that's right.
Sean's not there
and maybe
anymore.
that's why we didn't remember his name as clearly.
But, you know, like, you can kind of trace it back. How did we get here? You know, or how could this happen? It is through, like, you know, the interaction of all these factors to do with the power structures and the, you know, the access that certain people have to certain things. And then if people don't have access, how they then react in order to try to, like, gain power or gain privilege in that scenario, right? So, like, I don't know. That's how it can happen.
Well, also that scene, too, like, how can this happen? And I've talked about the composition of frames before, the, like, classic Soprano shot of two people talking and then the focus... maintaining focus on something in the background that's relevant to their conversation. And that's definitely happening in that scene too, where he says, how could this happen? There's like almost exactly the same as some of the other like framings that we've talked about, where you see somebody in between somebody, you see Furio in the back. So the relevance of him as somebody who came and emasculated them, which led to this, is definitely relevant.
Totally. I didn't even catch that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Another thing about that scene, actually, where Christopher gets shot that's interesting is, like, as he walks out, just, like, the framing of that shot, too. There's this big bridge in the background, which has been associated with death so much in this show so far. So, like, he comes out and they're really kind of, like, sticking with their symbols to kind of represent what's coming. And then, you know, he's shot immediately after that. And the only other thing I can really think of from the episode is I thought it was interesting when they're cracking the safe and they're in there, and that last line before the edit, and they kind of cut away from there, is where Christopher's saying, like, can you imagine being here, working day in and day out? So there's this kind of like this excitement that draws them to the world that they're in, but they all can't really process the like mundane existence of all these people around them. And yet they all struggle with this, you know, regularness of everyday life. That's like an issue for a lot of these characters.
Right.
Including in this episode, Matt and Sean, who that's kind of one of their main qualms with their work right now. Like, what are they doing? They're not doing anything. It's just like everyday life. They're just doing like gopher jobs. You know? Is that a thing? Can you be gopher jobs? Okay.
Yep.
Well, that's what they're doing.
You can be a gopher.
They're gophers. But yeah, like that is clearly like part of Christopher's psyche, for sure, right? And I mean, he's talked about that going all the way back to Legend of Tennessee Multisanti in the first season. You know, that's actually a term that he introduces, that fucking regularness of everyday life. But his inability to cope with working in an environment like that.
Right.
Yeah. But, I mean, you know, punchy episode, but it's also, as the shortest one, I have less thoughts.
Yeah,
sometimes.
A lot of these things maybe we'll come back to later.
Yeah, and I mean, I love it. What a great episode. I love the jacket.
Me too.
And I think there is a lot going on, and it's really interesting. And I think we're going deeper into some characters, in particular Carmela. Yeah. And I can't wait for the rest of the season.
I know. Only a few episodes in the season left, really.
It's going by quick. So... hope you've been enjoying, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.